Welcome to Future Histories. My name is Jan Groß, and it is my great pleasure to welcome Jasper Bernes in today's episode, or I should say welcome back, since I recorded a Future Histories episode with Jasper on planning and anarchy back in 2021. Jasper is an author, managing editor at Commune Magazine, and lecturer at the University of California, Berkeley. His new book, The Future of Revolution, which I very much enjoyed reading, is out now with Verso. There's a really interesting section in the book where Jasper engages quite a bit with the Grundprinzipien kommunistischer Produktion und Verteilung, the fundamental principles of communist production and distribution, a very important proposal for a democratic organization of production that the German council communist Jan Appel co-authored with the group of international communists back in the 1930s. Jasper takes a very, very close look at the proposal with regard to both value theory and the crucial aspect of compulsion to work. Everybody interested in these questions should take a close look at what Jasper has to say on these topics. And luckily, you can also listen to some of this in our conversation today. So without further ado, please enjoy today's episode with Jasper Bernes on workers' councils, labor time calculation, and the future of revolution. Welcome, Jasper.
Thanks for having me. It's good to be back.
Well, it's a pleasure. On the one hand, your book is a long history of the Workers' Council as idea. But on the other hand, and for me actually more importantly, your book is about a future potential.
Yep.
Your analysis of the history of workers' councils wants to bring to the fore what is relevant about this specific form for the future of revolution. And you see this potential because for you, workers' councils are what you call a revolutionary example. And I'd like to quote you here. You write, "The revolutionary example is an idea embedded in practice, an idea with a future, an idea that promises, through its own generalization, to usher in communism. It is action which, as example, as idea, finds its meaning in further action, in extension, intensification, and self-reflexive refinement." End quote. So let us start very broadly. I would say, why, Jasper, is the idea of workers' councils relevant for the future of revolution and not only an interesting aspect of its past?
It's a good question. I look at past revolutions in order to understand their particular view of the communist horizon. That is, to understand how those revolutions understood success. And I don't think we can, follow in their footsteps for a bunch of reasons. Things are quite different now. And also, they all failed in one way or another. But I do think that there's some things that we can learn from looking at these past revolutions, in that each revolution has revealed something about the horizon of overcoming capitalism. It has revealed certain logical functions or conditions that will need to be fulfilled. In a way, the workers' councils of the 1917 to 1923 wave revealed the most that has yet been revealed about that structure. There are a couple additional specifications that we can make, particularly with regard to how something like the Workers' Council might look today and who would participate in it. I think that because the nature of the capital-labor relationship has changed so much, that would look different. But in an abstract sense, the councils really disclose certain conditions for the construction of communism. They realize a particular idea of what it would mean for a revolution to be both proletarian and communist, in the sense that the councils are these structures that aim to include everyone, right? They allow for everyone to participate in decisions that are relevant to them. So on the margin, they could potentially include every person in as much as they were willing to join the revolution. But they also at the same time as including everyone, they produce the conditions for people to coordinate. And those two things are they're logical requirements of a revolution. That's to say, if a revolution is going to be proletarian, it needs to include the vast majority, because only if you include the vast majority can you have a revolution which will abolish class and class society and really be in service of the vast majority of humanity. And so at the same time, because not every human person can be in the same place, you're going to need some kind of coordination. And so the councils reveal that truth, but they also put forward a particular idea of how to meet those conditions.
You also looked at the Commune, specifically the Paris Commune of 1871, as a revolutionary example that might help us understand what will be needed in future revolutions. What is the difference between the Commune as a form, and there, of course, prominently the Paris Commune, and council communism or councils as a form, and what do both bring to the table?
That's a great question. So the workers' councils were in some way developed from the example of the Paris Commune. But there are key differences. So when I'm talking about the structure of inclusion and delegation, that's pretty much just the Commune as it conceived of itself. And, Marx calls this the form at last discovered into which, under which to work out the economic emancipation of man. So he thought that these kinds of structures were quite significant. At the same time, there was something lacking in that they were really municipal communal structures whose content was undefined. And at least in the Commune, they didn't have a kind of direct trajectory towards socializing production. And so where the councils are a bit different is that they are very specific about the proletarian restriction, and that these are bodies of the proletariat and for the proletariat. And also that they need to be immediately revolutionary bodies. That's to say that they're oriented toward the task of constructing socialism and socializing wealth. In practice, the councils did all kinds of things, and many councils were neither proletarian nor communist. But council communism, as it emerges in the context of the German Revolution, is a sort of response to this problem of the councils, the fact that the councils filled up with all of these, people from the majority socialist SPD and the trade unions and, middle-class intellectuals. And these people essentially voted to abolish the councils by ratifying a national constituent assembly and turning the councils into a springboard for the reconstruction of the state and the Weimar Republic. So the Weimar Republic is sort of, consecrated with the blood of the workers' councils. So yeah, so that's where they differ is that they have this kind of specific restriction, and that's also where I think if we were to think about what kinds of structures would be adequate to the revolution today, where we would probably need to do something a bit different than the workers' councils did. The really rigorous councils would demand some proof of work history. So you didn't have to be actively employed at the workplace, but you had to have shown that you were a proletarian, and then you could participate. And so I think today that would be much more difficult to use such a means to restrict participation in, commune or council or whatever you call it, partly because so many people have such kind of more tenuous relationship to work. And that means that probably the site of the emergence of the councils would be slightly different, but that has to do in part with how struggle has kind of changed since 1968 and is no longer centered on production in the same way. Because the workers' councils, really, they emerged from what, Kautsky and Luxemburg call the mass strike, right? They're initially instruments of the mass strike. So they emerge as a means to coordinate the attack on capital and to conduct the mass strike and shut down production. But as soon as they do that, they immediately find themselves in control over production. And they immediately make this transition, as Trotsky says, to becoming a workers' government or something like that, in the sense that they have to maintain certain services, right? They keep the lights on. They print the newspapers, but with the news of the revolution instead of the news of the ruling elites. And so there's almost a kind of implicit transition that happens immediately, where you move from the negation of the mass strike to the kind of positive project of communism.
Yeah, and we will definitely get to the point where we try to figure out what would be a form of council communist revolution today. But before we get there, I'm curious about some other aspects of your book.
Yeah.
There are some very interesting passages about self-organization.
Mm-hmm.
First, you state that, and I quote you here, self-organization does not unite the working class, but splits it. And then later on, you write, even though self-organization is the very presupposition of revolutionary action, as and if the revolution unfolds, it becomes an obstacle which the revolution must overcome. End quote. So could you maybe elaborate what self-organization can do and crucially what it cannot do? Because this seems to be quite important in your eyes.
Yes. Well, I think, the term self-organization gets used in many ways, and there are really important critiques of it. For instance, Rodrigo Nunes has been here in Oakland, and we've been talking. He did a talk in his book, Neither Vertical nor Horizontal. He makes a really intelligent critique of the concept of self-organization by pointing out that basically everything is self-organized from some perspective. I use the term in a more limited sense in that, for me, self-organization is kind of proletarian organization that is against the institutions of this world, right? So both against kind of workers' institutions and against capitalist institutions, right? That's where we call it self-organization. A wildcat strike is self-organization, but a union-led strike is not. And so that, excludes other kinds of things. At some level, even a union campaign is self-organization, depending on how you define the self. And that's already where the problem comes in. But so when you talk about proletarian self-organization, it's usually always some section of the class. It's never everyone, right? It's the workers who wildcat against all of the other workers. And you notice something immediately, which is that the action is usually selfish in some way, like they're doing it for something that is at stake for that particular section of workers. But there's always this kind of universalism to that move, in a sense that inspires people to imitate it far and wide. And so there's always a sense in which, an action, if workers take over their factory, for example, it's both selfish in the sense they're doing it for themselves, but also not in the sense that they're doing it for other proletarian struggles elsewhere and as a kind of inspiration. And they understand that they can only really succeed, at least in terms of revolution, through the coordination of action with those other proletarian factions. So it's never the entirety of the class organizing itself. It's always a kind of subtraction of some fraction of the class. So it ends up splitting movements, splitting the workers' movement. And when you look at revolutions, they usually emerge from some split in the movement itself. And you need to recognize that fact. Self-organization becomes a limit, though, where workers have no real means to coordinate, and thus they can only act for themselves in a way that might even be deleterious for the whole class or the whole proletarian movement. For example, if factories, workers take over their factories, as happened in Spain, one of the first things you see is that productivity just plummets, of course, because there's no discipline, and that you have to kind of expect that. But without any kind of means of coordination, you had a situation where some workers were sort of interested in the benefit of their own enterprise, to the exclusion of thinking about the kind of common construction of socialism. And in the absence of any kind of vision or sense of how to coordinate, that makes sense, right? So you got in Spain, you got what is sometimes called enterprise egotism, or it was called by some of the anarchists, in the sense that, there's a kind of egoism of self-organization that emerges, right? And that is, counter to the communist project. But it's not something that, without any kind of vision of, common plan for common production, for common use, that's only to be expected. And so in a certain sense, a revolution requires these moments of self-organization, but then they have to kind of overcome the strict bounds of the self in order to really produce communism, which is no longer defined necessarily by this opposition between self and other. It's a regime of everything for everyone. And so, there has to be some thinking of kind of the other organization and, and fundamentally recognition of the universality of the communist project, and that, if you're really a communist, you don't just be like, this is our commune and this is our stuff. If someone shows up and they want food and want to participate, you open your arms to them. So there's a sense of hospitality and kind of universalism that I think is an essential part of the communist project. And, all the more so in a century in which we're going to see, migration on a scale that is orders of magnitude larger than what we see now. And people are going to be moving all around the earth to find places that are habitable and hopefully optimal. And so, there's going to be just a constant shifting of human habitation over the next century, if we want to keep a lot of people alive and give them the opportunity to thrive and live good lives. So I think that has to be that universalism has to be a really important part of the vision. So that's what I mean by the kind of self-organization becoming a limit.
Mm-hmm. But would you say that because at some point it felt as if you were saying that all conflicts of interest would disappear in communism, which is highly unlikely, I would say. Yeah. I understand the argument that enterprise egoism is something very different from the fact that there will be certain conflicts of interest in general if you have a plan in common and still prevailing some form of localized interests, which will probably always exist in some way, shape, or form. So there would have to be some form of either a negotiation or some form of mediation and mechanism that kind of addresses the fact that there is a need for this overarching coordination, but taking into account the fact that there will probably be conflict of interest at different levels of these coordinating processes in communism as well, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. It just depends on how you resolve these conflicts of interest, or how you kind of find a way to deal with them without mechanisms of domination, I guess, no?
Well, I think I would slightly disagree, and it would require us to define interest.
Yeah.
Right? I do think that communism is a situation in which, by definition, the self-interest of the individual and the self-interest of the group align. Right? That's in some way a definition of it.
Fully?
And not fully, but in the sense that, as Marx says, the condition for the free development of each is the condition for the free development of all. That is, and so you want to eliminate forms of egoism and individualization that will hinder that process. It doesn't mean there aren't going to be conflicts or disputes, but I don't know that they come down to interest. And so, for example, it's like if you individualize consumption, right, and you make that the mechanism for people to access social wealth. If you say you have to work a certain amount of hours in order to access wealth, then you create a kind of individualism, as compared to, for example, if most of what people need to survive is already socialized. You're eating from a canteen. You're going to free clinics. You're picking food from the garden, right? And then you don't have a sense of this. Of course, if somebody says, we don't want to expand the garden and make it, 300 square feet larger, and you really care about the garden. Of course, there's a conflict, but is that really a conflict of interest or just a conflict of kind of desire and planning? I would say that the fundamental character of communism is that it's settled on some kind of fundamental unanimity. That isn't complete and conclusive. There's lots of areas that don't even need to be deliberated, in which people can just do different things or disagree. And then there's, there will be debates over decisions, and probably, different kinds of groups will form. But I doubt that it will be legible in terms of this or that person's interests. Especially if people are already organized in many overlapping ways. I like how some people I've been talking with about this they think of it as polycentric planning, right? So there's many different centers, right? And so you're already part of making decisions with you're doing multiple things in the course of a week, right? With different groups, and you're deliberating with them and making decisions, but those are different spaces in which you exist. And so, your interest in one area as a participant in this, fabrication shop, or your interest as a member of this residential area or this soccer club, right? Sure. But those are just aspects of yourself. So of course there'll be conflicts, and there will be deliberation, and in the beginning there may be scarcity, and you may have to ration. That is where real kind of conflict can emerge, especially when you're dealing with the fact that different people have different needs. And so you really have to kind of try to work with some sense of fairness, inherent. There are things that people sort of consider fair. It's like if there's, only a limited amount of some item, most people will consider it fair to just divide it equally, even if they recognize that there's some, suffering involved.
At some point in the book, you say that it's always just a fraction of the proletariat who engages in self-organization. And I would be interested in your opinion on the underlying notion of subject with regard to self-organization, because in some of the kind of models around democratic planning, there is a certain normative notion of the subject as a very self-activating and self-governing subject, which would kind of imply that if the conditions are right, everybody would be this ideal subject, which is seen as an active subject, which is able to, let's say, self-organize itself as a subject of action, I would say. And I always had a huge problem with this idealized normative notion of the subject as active. And with regard to this point of fairness and what you just described as a more or less intuitive approach towards this question of fairness, I guess it would be important to also come to a point where there is a plurality of subjectivities that does not kind of fall back into this trap of a subject that is always a worker, basically.
Right.
How do you think about this notion of the subject in general?
Well, I don't know that I have any use for it. I've never found it to be a particularly fruitful way to think about these questions. And I guess in my essay, Revolutionary Motives, I tried to kind of approach things from the standpoint of subjectivity. But the idea of a mass of people being one subject in some sense just seems to me anthropomorphic error. Perhaps I haven't read Hegel well enough, and I'll understand it in some way. But I do think pluralism is a big part of it, and that's why, I think that we're dealing with something that would be about the Constitution of many pluralities. And even though at the same time there's this dimension of common planning and a kind of commonality, at the same time that would be a planning for plurality, right? The last time I was here, we talked about planning and anarchy. And, I say that we have to plan for anarchy in some way. That also means planning for the unexpected, right? So there are many things that don't need to be deliberately or consciously discussed, right? And there has to be a recognition that certain kinds of things will happen probably informally or spontaneously, and they don't need to be scripted, and they don't even need to be worried about. And that's the space where real differentiation and possibility for the new can emerge, right? But then there also has to be a way for people to kind of transform these explicit mechanisms, and they have to be tractable to human intervention and transparent. People need to understand how decisions are being made. I mean, I guess there is, I like the term human community. If that's a notion of subject, then okay. There does need to be some sense of human belonging, in a sense, that communism requires, I think, a notion of the human universal and this idea that everything belongs to everyone else. So maybe that requires some thinking of the social totality, but I don't really conceive of it as a subject. Partly because I think that communism will develop in lots of different ways, in different dimensions, and on different scales. The commune is the way the commune imagined itself and the way the councils imagined themselves. It's a kind of fractal form. It's self-similar, right? There's these structures of delegates within delegates. And Marx describes it as an expansive form, right? So it's constantly changing and adapting. And I think that allows for, especially as you socialize more and more wealth, and it becomes possible to just provide more and more things on demand. And as the kind of individual mode of interacting and appropriating changes, there's, all kinds of directions people can go. And some of it's going to be an inscrutable process of ethical transformation. People's values will change, and there'll be a new culture that we can't really determine. And probably it doesn't have to be one thing. I mean, I think a certain idea of communism as a monoculture is really problematic. And I think that, in fact, there will be lots of different, pluralities of different human communities and forms of life, because there's so many ways in which you can live in a communist manner. And so that's what, Marx talks about it as the end of prehistory, right? It's not like everything changes. It's not like everything comes to a stop and you've arrived at this kind of perfect state of perfection. It's actually a new state of development and free development, which is constantly changing. As new possibilities will emerge, new sciences and technologies and understandings, and probably a lot of time will be spent on forms of individual and collective cultivation that we can't even really understand, that will be largely about learning and spirituality. Who knows, right? Aesthetic. People will probably spend a lot of time just doing art.
And you engaged quite a bit with a book that the German council communist Jan Appel co-authored with the group of international communists, the GIK, I guess. It was published in 1930 under the title Fundamental Principles of Communist Production and Distribution, Grundprinzipien kommunistischer Produktion und Verteilung. Before we get into your critique of the proposal, could you give us an outline of what the GIK wanted to accomplish with their book?
So the Grundprinzipien was an attempt to come up with a plan for how the councils would socialize production and coordinate with each other. It's a fascinating document that was written by one of the main characters in my book. Is this guy Jan Appel, who he was part of the revolutionary shop stewards movement, which eventually led the insurrection that ended the war and the empire, and formed councils. And then he eventually joined up with the KPD, which is the Council Communist Party, and he did a lot of crazy things, including hijacking a boat to go to Russia to be a delegate for the KPD, and then he was in prison for stealing the boat, And he decided, and the German Revolution at that point was mostly done. And he said, well, now it's about time to read Marx and figure out like what we were really trying to do. What were we going to do if we would have won? And so he sits down and he reads Marx, and he just, this was a kind of a self-taught, proletarian intellectual, and he, based on reading Marx, and there are in fact many indications in Capital and other places where Marx sort of indicates some degree of how he conceives of things, including this labor certificate idea will become central to the plan. And so, they essentially come up with this method and for organizing production that is centered around the central council communist idea. I mean, you can trace this back to Marx, which is that you need some way for the totality of production to be comprehensible to every worker, and also for them to have some way to affect what's being produced. And so they come across the idea that basically the socially necessary average hour of labor will become that measure. And so they put forward the idea of kind of transparent, rational, collective labor time accounting that would be a way for, as Pennacook says, he was convinced of this idea. Originally, he didn't buy it, but he was convinced of it by Jan Appel, and the group that he was working with, the GIK, puts out this book in collaboration with Appel. They revise it with him. This would be a way of the average hour of labor would be a way for, as Pennacook says, the books of production to be open, perpetually laid in front of everybody's eyeballs. And regardless of what I think about the particular mechanism with this hour of labor, I think the idea that production needs to be transparent and that there needs to be a kind of vision of the totality. You can call that centralization, but also power needs to be dispersed. You can call that decentralization. That's what planning should be doing. Now, they adopt this idea of the socially necessary hour of labor, but a big part of it is that there is something like a wage that still persists, which is to say that you get paid, every worker gets paid according to the actual hours they worked. So there's a kind of translation of actual hours into socially necessary average hours. And this is more or less what Marx suggests would happen at the end of the very complicated critique of the Gotha program. So that's their vision. And one thing that's really important about their vision, I think, is that they recognize that certain functions, certain activities that are provided by the councils would be essentially a free gift, and that not everything would have to be paid for in labor certificates. For example, the kind of administrative work of calculating labor hours, that's not something that would be paid for through the certificate. So there has to be a kind of deduction from the certificate for these kinds of these goods that are consumed collectively. And they recognize that probably a lot of things like, medicine and, all kinds of services would have to be provided in that way. And they have a vision where as the system becomes more and more productive, more and more things can be put into this kind of free use category where they can just be distributed on demand and they no longer need to be metered. So in that sense, they envision a kind of withering away of these mechanisms, an approach to communism that would be more or less moneyless and where goods would be distributed on demand. And so this proposal becomes really important to what gets later called communization theory, and Gilles Devey and others develop a powerful critique of it. But I think the critique kind of goes wrong in a few ways. One thing is that it's predicated on saying that the law of value persists in this state of affairs, and I don't think that's exactly quite correct if we're going to think through Marx's value theory. At the same time, I ultimately conclude that to meter individual labor would be sort of useless. In if not counterproductive, and that in fact And also that counting labor hours isn't the most useful thing from the perspective of planning. I mean, I think this is something that would probably be very apparent to you. It's not actually the most, I mean, it's important to know how much time it will take to do things, but there's all kinds of other calculations that are in fact more important, right? How do you determine where need is? And that's all kinds of stuff that is really not even discussed in their plan. And even Paul Maddock, who had spent the 1930s advocating for this thing, by the time he writes an introduction to the German reissue of the Grundprinzipien in 1969, he says that, you know, society has become so productive that this kind of individual metering of labor through the certificate would no longer really be practicable. And that there's just other ways that essentially, you know, social consumption has already been socialized so much that you no longer really need these kind of individual modes of appropriation. And but nonetheless, I still think what's correct about it is that you still need this way of making production transparent and tractable. The problem with the certificate is that ultimately it was part of the Council Communist vision in the KPD in their manifesto, the program. One of the things they say is that, you know, is that their party will maintain ruthless enforcement of the compulsion to work, right? Everybody must work. So there's kind of vision of a process of the proletariat overcoming itself through a kind of generalization of the proletarian condition. And this might have made sense. I mean, I'm not sure that I think they might have won on this thing. And it was already a society of work and workers, right? Where you had this mass skilled labor. So, you know, there's something that might make sense in that moment. But now, so much of what people do is useless anyways for the prospect of creating communism, that I just think that would be unnecessary. And also that I think from my study of revolutionary situations, when you have this compulsion to work, when work becomes both an obligation and a right, the power of workers to resist is actually incredibly strong, stronger than you would think. And in fact, in that situation where you can't really fire workers, you can't discipline in the same way that capital can, it's really hard to get them to do anything at all. You know, you see this in the USSR. They could produce mountains of coal and iron, stuff that can be produced under essentially forced labor conditions. But as soon as it came to producing anything that required any care or skill, they would just produce mountains of defects, right? Because they didn't have the managerial power to discipline workers. And so if the basis of it is you still use these systems of compulsion that sort of work through the system of the wage, I think you'll actually just find it not very productive at all. It won't be helpful. And it's actually, and to go back to this point about individualization, when you certificate individual labor, you encourage these kind of egoistic impulses and this kind of atomistic, competition. But when labor is already socialized, then those conflicts of interest don't really emerge in the same degree. So that's an argument for socializing a lot of, or say communizing a lot of distribution immediately. Like the difference between having cafeterias versus having a bunch of like single family homes where people like go get their stuff and go back and cook it themselves. And it's not that, there can't be kind of individual, like in one way, maybe the certificates could be used in a very limited way for like special goods or something like that. That's ultimately how the KPD imagines it. They're like, we're never going to get rid of certificates because there's some things that only individual workers want. So the certificates become a way to like meter kind of demand for luxury goods. And I think that would not matter at all. As long as most of what people needs is socialized, you're probably already on the track to communism. And eventually it won't matter, like, somebody will get the stereo and then they'll share it with their friends or whatever. So I think that there may be some role for some kind of certificate, but for the most part, it just wouldn't be, it wouldn't work. And then also it creates this problem where you have to identify certain things that people do as activities that merit a wage, and then other kinds of things aren't, right? So it also creates this possibility where, for example, reproductive labor and things like that are kind of informal and outside of the metering of certificates. And you could see that would be a way for like gender domination to persist. You also have to, the other thing is that, you say something like ruthless compulsion to work, you have to determine who is able to work, right? That requires there to be some social judgment about ability, right? And that's really hard to say, like who is or isn't able to work, and these kind of questions of ability, I think can become really vexing, And so, and really if somebody who doesn't want to work is kind of somebody who can't work, and if you've ever worked with people who don't want to work, they're almost worse than nothing, right? And so maybe we can still, do without them. And ultimately, I think most people do want to contribute, and do have a desire to be a part of things. And a lot of people do things even if they don't really like them. It doesn't mean it has to be enjoyable. People take care of their kids and they cook for themselves and they clean up. They may not always like these things, but they do them. So yeah, I think that the labor certificate in the Principium, it proposes itself as a mechanism of measurement and coordination, but really the work it's supposed to do is to compel people to work, and that's not admitted, and I don't think that part would actually function. If you need it to do that, you're already lost. If you don't need it to do that, then it becomes somewhat superficial.
Yeah, very interesting. I mean, I totally share this. I have a huge problem with some strands within the planning debate, which kind of really want to stick to this idea that it is necessary to have some form of compulsion to work, and I really don't agree with that. What I really
think it's the most important thing for us to discuss now.
Come again?
I think it's just a very important point to debate within the planning, and I think it gets underemphasized, this question of compulsion.
Absolutely. What I liked about the way that you frame it is that you bring up the two tests, actually, two theoretical tests.
Yeah.
The first is the test of value, and the other one is the test of communism. And I think in your answer, you already hinted towards these two tests. So the first one would actually ask if a proposal for a communist mode of reproduction does actually reproduce the value form as well. And the other test would not only ask that, it would also ask that, because it's a precondition actually for communism to exist, you say. So the value form most definitely will have to be overcome, but you would also have to apply a test of communism. And the test of communism is basically pretty much tied to what you just laid out in terms of compulsion to work, no?
Mm-hmm.
So as I just said, you kind of critique this idea, this specific idea of council communism, but you still agree that some form of measurement is most definitely of need and of use and will be applied. So your argument is actually not that council communism or the Grundprinzipien are completely useless, but that they need to be fused with communization theory, basically, in order to pass the test of communism. I think you already pointed towards some of the aspects that this would entail, but are there other aspects that would need to change with regard to the form of council communism as such in order to pass the test of communism, as you frame it?
I do think that in some ways communization is anticipated by certain groups or ideas within the council communist movement. It's not, I mean, some of the things are in fact anticipated by these groups. For example, Palmatic already saying, hey, we're beyond labor certificates here. One thing that doesn't get discussed enough, but does appear in some places, is the need to not just take over workplaces, but to really transform them in order to overcome the division of labor, right? And because there are inequalities between people are sedimented into the division of labor and the differences in material resources between one place and another. And so we can't just take over the existing means of production of capitalism and run them in a communist way and expect these again, this is actually comes down to kind of interests. Expect these divisions of labor to persist and to not undermine the communist project. For example, right, we have the division between town and country, which is mapped onto a division between certain kinds of labor. And it's more complicated now since the countryside is fundamentally industrialized. Nonetheless, the project of overcoming the town and countryside distinctions, so where you live doesn't really determine what you do to a strong degree, is, you know, part of the project of communism. In the same way that, you know, you can't just have one area where people do, you know, like one area where everybody works in the mine and then another area where everybody's doing like computer work or whatever. That's a division of labor that's sedimented into geography and is, you know, an imbalance and has to be overcome. So that's, you know, that's something that that Bordiga is always emphasizing, and I think it's really important to recognize that the process of socialization of wealth is going to require a transformation of those underlying techniques and technologies in order to make them more conducive to human life. And I think the Council Communists recognize this, but it isn't emphasized. And also, we live in a moment in which capital is much more highly developed, and it started to develop in these particular kinds of ways where these problems of the sedimentation of the division of labor in the productive forces are bigger problems now, right? Because there's whole areas of the planet where there is no industry, and there's, you know, a much more kind of highly, you know, localized division of labor that will become it's going to be an issue for the revolution. Right? Unless you have an instantly worldwide revolution, people are going to find themselves depending on these supply chains that are essentially broken by the revolution. And so that's one way in which the international division of labor needs to be overcome. You know, that's one dimension that I think is underemphasized.
And I mean, just for me to better understand that, what would that look like to overcome this division of labor? Because we would still need to, we would want to produce certain functions that are now being produced through this division of labor. So you mentioned the mines. Mm-hmm. I guess we would still want to have computers after the revolution. So we would still need rare earth minerals, and hence we would still need mines. So mm-hmm. when you say that we need to overcome this division of labor, how then would this be organized in order to not have this compartmentalized type of one class, basically, of people working in the mines and the others only on the computer? Would there be a form of rotation? Would it be through self-selection, that people do agree by themselves that they maybe are interested in doing some work that others might consider to be very annoying or or cumbersome or something like that? So what would be the mechanism to guarantee that there is still a certain form of productivity that we would want to have, but not the negative aspects of division of labor that you just mentioned?
Right. I mean, I think it's a great question. Obviously, I'm not saying that everybody will be doing everything all the time, right? That would be ridiculous, right? There is absolutely going to be specialization, right? And certain kinds of things are going to take a long time to learn, and therefore not everyone will do it, right? Not everybody has to be able to set a bone, for example, right? Or treat people medically. So I guess what I envision as overcoming the division of labor is, rotation, essentially, where there's, one important aspect is there's, we often think about the right to enter into a new line of work, like equality of opportunity, right? People be like, hey, I want to go be a doctor, so that you can, right, in communism. But also there has to be a right to exit and say, hey, I don't like it here, I want to go somewhere else. And but I also think that there's will be, yeah, probably a kind of mandatory rotation, in the sense that there'll be an expectation people will do lots of different things, and as you know, and that, you know, sort of work that people don't like to do will be shared pretty equally, um, and so, you know, there'll probably be a mix of different methods. And, you know, people might have like some specialization and then do a lot of more general work. I think also, you know, seasonal rotation, for example, people can, you know, go out, and a big part of it is about the food supply, right? That's one of the biggest imbalances, is that we tend to grow food. We tend to grow lots of food in these one areas, right? And you actually never have enough people living out there. So you always have to, for harvests, you always have to have a kind of a migration, a seasonal migration. And so I do think that for a lot of reasons, much food will need to be localized. And that's one of the ways that the division between town and country is overcome, is that cities become less, they look less like what we think of today as cities. And the countryside becomes less of what we think of as the countryside. And there's a kind of, not that everything will be the same, but there's kind of merger of, and food production will be, for a lot of reasons, you know, localized to a great degree. But then maybe sometimes it can't be, right? And you'll need to kind of migrate people out to certain areas. And maybe when it comes to like work like mining or whatever, you know, obviously people could volunteer to do that in certain areas. It just wouldn't be that like everybody who's living in this particular area, they're all miners for all their lives, right? And that's all they do. And you know, and the question of like work that no one wants to do, how you deal with that. I think there can be things like incentives. Those don't necessarily impact anything, because people also understand that's fair in a way, right? Like if you say like, hey, we're going to build this like this sick hotel people can live in while they're like working in the mines, and like, you know, have these great parties out there, and that's an incentive for people to go be miners, people will be like, yeah, that's fair, because mining sucks. And and so I don't think, and it's not like a permanent kind of hierarchy that could be created, because it's just a rotation, right? So there's nothing wrong with certain kinds, especially in-kind incentives, right? It's not money, it can't be accumulated. Those I think that's perfectly fine. So I think there's probably lots of mechanisms to deal with this, and that, you know, that's part of the discussion around planning now, and we would be part of the work of constructing a new society. People probably try a lot of different things.
And I mean, you just mentioned that there would be an expectation that people take part in constructing our social wealth. And we already established that, for example, labor certificates should not be used to command labor in any way, shape, or form. So then the question kind of comes up, if labor time is measured but doesn't serve as this regulating principle, as it is in the Grundprinzipien, what then is the regulating principle instead? And if it's solidarity, which would be an obvious candidate in some form, I guess, how can this be brought about in a sense that it is, or in a way that it is kind of strong enough and internalized enough so that it can serve this function of being a form of regulating principle, so to speak?
Well, I think there are probably a number of different ways to describe the principle. You know, I like everything belongs to everyone, for example, or, you know, from each according to their ability, to each according to their need. There's all kinds of ways to describe it, and you know, it's going to be partly, there's the principle in the sense of like, this is stating the principle, but then there's going to be this ethical development in which people will learn to understand these in all kinds of different ways, and probably develop new ways of understanding them that will be useful. I don't think we need, in terms of a scalar number, we don't need one metric. Labor time might be useful. I mean, obviously if you're running some project, you want to know how many people you need to build the house. Obviously, you're like, you want to know that you need 20 people, not 100, right? Because if you ask 100 people to come and they're just sitting around, then you're going to learn. Only ask 20 next time, right? So these are very basic forms of calculation that, are going to be performed. As a global metric, labor, like counting hours, I just don't think it's that useful, really. I'm not sure what it really tells us. It certainly doesn't tell us what people need, nor is it a measure of, collective well-being or anything like that. And so I'm open to society inventing all kinds of measurements of ways of understanding what's happening. And there's probably going to be lots of ways of measuring it. I like this idea that free development is going to be the basis, right? What does that mean? Well, people are allowed to kind of evolve and change. And that's so production for need, but production also for the free development of, every person, and where free development is the supreme condition, Marx says somewhere. And so that might require some notion of what necessity is, what social necessity is, or what freedom is. But probably there are going to be all kinds of forms of calculation that will be of use, right? And that's for the mathematicians and engineers of the future to figure out. I was just talking last night with Rodrigo Nunes, and he was, saying that, well, from a perspective of degrowth, we would want to, measure entropy, essentially, like measure how much disorganization is being produced by human activity, in the sense of, that every throughput or different kinds of productive processes create a certain amount of waste or destruction. I'm not sure that that's like a measurement that can actually be done, but if it were, that would be a useful thing, right? And it would be one of the many things that we would want to be calculating. For a while, I was often in conversation with Bjorn Westergaard. Have you had him on your show before?
No.
He's an interesting person who has a lot to say about planning and very different ideas than me. But when I was writing that Planning and Anarchy article, I think I footnote him. We were having a conversation one time, and he said, he said the smartest thing. He said, the good is a vector, not a scalar. And it's true. There's just many values that we want to optimize. It's not like we can optimize one value, labor time or some Lagrangian shadow price. This is the fantasy of planning discourse, that there's like one supreme value. But in fact, human values are numerous. And so there's going to be all kinds of things that people will want to, and there will be this, deliberation about what it is. Do we value a healthy ocean for its own sake? How do you measure that? I do, but it's something that will require a lot of effort to restore, that. What is the natural equilibrium we want to bring back? We're not going back to like the Holocene exactly. So we make choices about how we want to, transform the human metabolism with nature. It's not like there's one path, right? And so, there will be lots of ways to sort of measure this, especially from the ecological perspective. What is it that we care about? Do we just care about carbon and temperature, or are these other values that we care about? Ecological diversity, et cetera, et cetera. How do we measure that?
Yeah. And I mean, also, I think I didn't state the question quite clearly, because it was not so much pointing towards this question whether or which kinds of indicators are necessarily, and I absolutely agree that we will need plenty, but maybe a little bit more in the direction of what would be the drive that is kind of pushing the whole thing, so to speak. I think at some point you have this quote with regard to the planning mechanism in the Soviet Union, and you say that it was a motor without a spring or something like that. Yeah. So the question would more go into the direction of what the spring would be, and that's why I pointed towards kind of solidarity, but co-development.
Free development.
Free development. Yeah,
Yeah,
right. I
because
mean,
that's the idea is that people want their lives to be better, however they conceive of better, right? They're going in some direction, even if it's just more of the same, right? That's a kind of better. And there's a communism would be a situation in which you recognize that everyone else getting what their definition of better makes your better too, right? And you want to create a situation where that's obvious, right? Where it's clear and apparent. So I think that thing is you're part of a society that's constantly transforming and improving. There's this kind of perfectionist impulse, and that is why you're there, is because you believe that that the humanity is actually meeting its challenges and living up to its potential, right? Allowing human potential finally to flourish. All of this squandered potential, right? That's been wasted, toiling away in the earth. And how many Einsteins and Shakespeare's or whoever I mean, how much brilliance, artistic and scientific, has been squandered. I think that's part of being a society that's actually really allowing each child to kind of live its full potential. To me, that sounds like a principle that would animate me. But other people might have different values. So I think it can also be lots of different things.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, right now we are already jumping into a hopefully not so distant future in which some form of communism is already being realized. But I would like to get back to the question why you say that the council movement, or some form of council movement, is the right form for the 21st century revolution, basically, or for coming revolutions, because you argue against, and this is, I guess, kind of a little bit controversial, probably, right. You argue against what you see as a prevailing tendency on the left, namely going back to rebuilding traditional bearers of labor power, such as classical unions and strong parties. So you argue against this because you think that this is not adequate, or these are not adequate forms for the 21st century. So what would you say, why is basically the council, or council communism more broadly, an adequate form for the 21st century? And are these councils, in your opinion, an adequate form regardless of place and stage of industrialization, for example? So is it a universally good idea to engage in some form of council communism right now, regardless of where you are?
Yes. Well, that's the big question. I think I want to say both yes and no, and it depends on what you mean by a council. So certain council communists would probably think what I'm talking about doesn't really qualify as a council. That's why I look at the Workers' Council, not just as a form, but as a series of functions for the production of communism that need to be fulfilled. And what I'm arguing is that we're going to need to fulfill those functions one way or another. And what does it is going to probably look like a council to some degree, in the sense that, right, like earlier I said, the commune form is broadly inclusive. It can potentially draw in everyone on the margin in as much as they're willing to kind of join the communist project. But it also is unitary in the sense that it allows people to coordinate together. And that implies some mechanism of delegation, right? I think it logically follows that people, and it also mandates that delegation is, as Marx says, revocable, right? Because if the delegates then do something that the base doesn't like, then it's no longer vastly inclusive, right? So there's a requirement for a certain iterative feedback process, just from the very logic of it has to include everybody and it has to allow them to plan in common. And so I think that's just simply the nature of what a revolution is. We may call them something different, and they may look very different in many ways. But I still think that we therefore have a lot to learn from workers' councils. What might be different now is that we live in this era in which the workers' movement is moribund, and there's no longer a sense of identification with the workplace to the same degree. And you really see this emerging with 68, and with every struggle since then, there's this kind of fascinating reemergence of the Workers' Council in the 1970s. But it emerges in these very different conditions in which people are disidentified with work. And if you look at the history of struggles over the last 50 years, they more and more are kind of taking place in the sphere of circulation. And so, as I say, the Workers' Councils emerged out of the mass strike, but our mass struggles are no longer mass strikes. And so, therefore, the kind of location of councils in the future revolution, may not be strictly centered upon the workplace, even though it's going to have to eventually subsume workplaces and involve them, precisely because the workers' movement is no longer this kind of center for proletarian action. And so then I think it's more likely that the bodies would be regional bodies, in that sense, more like the commune, but they would still have to address this question of the proletarian and communist condition. How do they, make sure that it really is, that they are organizations of the vast majority and that they are oriented towards the production of communism? And how to do that in this situation, that's what remains to be determined. And I don't have a solution to that, because I think that there are probably many, many solutions. And that's the work of the future revolution, to figure out exactly how that takes place. And it will certainly involve lots of false starts, right? You kind of have to expect that what happened in Germany with the councils, where you form them and immediately a bunch of people want to go into them to destroy them. You have to accept that that's probably going to be the way it plays out anywhere. And there's going to be a struggle over that form. And, hopefully our team wins in the end. But so that's the most I can say, because obviously there's so much that is contingent, and revolutions are unpredictable. They always emerge when least expected. And, the future conditions of revolution will be crisis conditions, and will be in some sense responding to those crises, just like the German Revolution was, primarily an anti-war movement. People just wanted the friggin' war to end. They'd been eating turnips for years, and everyone was dying on the front, and it was pointless, and they were done. May not be a war. It could be some climate disaster. But of course, responding to those conditions will be the first task of the revolution in some sense, right? Meeting people's needs, organizing, just as the German Revolution organized to make sure the war ended. So there's much that's unpredictable, which is of course not surprising. I mean, I think the most common way of looking at this question is to say it's all unpredictable. There's nothing we can say about it, right? There's nothing we can learn from the past revolutions. There's nothing we can say about future revolutions. It's inscrutable. And there's some truth to that. Like you have to recognize the fundamentally unpredictable character of these things. At the same time, if we take this other approach, we can still maybe learn some things and get some sense of what things might look like. If I had more to tell you, I would be out there doing it in the streets right now. If I had some secret, one simple trick.
Well, it doesn't have to be one simple trick. And I mean, it's highly unlikely that there is one. But I mean, there are people who conceptualize the revolution or prefiguration as revolution, basically. And that would be one route to kind of look at it, to say, all right, you have these necessities that will have to be in place in order to make communism possible, as you kind of distilled them from your analysis of, in this case, the council communist tradition, or the council tradition more broadly. And so we would have preconditions in terms of certain principles that would need to be a part of the movement itself, so to speak. But then, additionally, we could say that prefigurative practice in the here and now is a way of establishing a network of places of communist reproduction in the here and now, where a certain form of function that will be needed in a situation of a revolutionary upheaval are already in place, or at least partly in place, so that there is not a starting from scratch type of situation.
Yeah.
So I guess that would be an obvious candidate to point towards, to say that some form of prefigurative politics is necessarily a part of any revolutionary effort in order to not basically fail from the start, no?
Right. And I think we see that in current struggles. I mean, I think we have to be careful with prefiguration. And that oftentimes, movements that are pre-revolutionary, what they can prefigure is somewhat limited.
Right.
But at the same time, I do think that the movements that we see in our time are tending towards communism, many of them, right? Whether it's the Gilets jaunes or the Estallido Social, the George Floyd uprising. That's why I end with it. To call for the abolition of the police is to call for communism. It's the only way it could actually occur. And so I do think that these movements represent, an attempt to prefigure in certain ways. Often it's a kind of ethical prefiguration, right? It's kind of a way of cultivating the values of solidarity and communism in a way. And that's why you see, I think, value and statements of value, like not value in Marx's term, but value in the sense of like good, bad, ethical value becoming the slogans of these movements. And so I really like what EndNotes have to say about it. And they look at this thing, which is this kind of inward turn of the movements, which is often criticized, right? It's like, okay, these movements become inward. They kind of focus on themselves. They focus on transforming themselves because they lack the inability to really affect power. And there's certainly truth to that. But also at the same time, it really is the production of revolutionaries without a revolution and the production of a communist sensibility. And so even things like, there's all this hatred towards woke. But, in some ways, woke is really just this kind of new ethics that's emerged from social movements that's really about trying to, inculcate certain values that are fundamentally communist, in the sense of a kind of respect for others, a sense of the kind of, commitment to kind of, equality of access and opportunity. And so, in some ways that's maybe what we're seeing, and Trump is in some ways a reaction against that kind of intuitive anti-capitalist politics, even if there are forms of it that, seem cynical or whatever, ultimately it's a good thing. And it's a sign of a kind of changing consciousness, that is, part of the emergence of whatever will be communism, right? That's not unimportant. It's just really hard to talk about, without sounding like a fool or becoming just a guru, right? Inventing a religion. So I don't want to do that. But there is something happening, in these movements, where, really people put the question of how we live together, pose that to themselves, and they make it about treating each other, better and with dignity and value. And, there's a lot of criticism directed towards that, but sometimes maybe we miss what's actually positive in that, which is that, these are the future revolutionaries. And so, to kind of, to recognize that there's this, sort of underground generational process that is a part of every revolution, right? It's never just, it seems like it comes out of nowhere, but it's both the, result of a kind of long transformation of values and a shift of ideas and, the emergence of something completely unpredicted.
Yeah, and I'm personally all in favor of that and do not criticize it, but I guess a fair criticism would be something similar to what you argue when you analyze the Commune, and that you say, well, this type of kind of political layer that was the Commune in Paris is very important and is a necessary part of it, but it will not be successful in the end if it does not also engage in a form of economic coordination as well. So analogously, is that a word? I'm not sure. So similarly, one might say that this type of kind of ethical prefiguration that you just talked about is certainly one important element, but the question would then be, how can we push further in terms of a materialist prefiguration as well, I guess, some form of...
I see the question.
Yeah.
I think maybe we might have slightly different ideas about this. My sense is that, absent the suspension of state power, there's very little you can do. So that's why I think of the collapse or the partial suspension of state power is the first precondition of the revolution, and your ability to socialize wealth and to kind of do communism really depends on the degree to which the police and the army have been weakened, right? You can see just in the George Floyd uprising, the police are weakened and everyone can loot and they can share what they've looted freely with each other, and there's a kind of, proto-communism in that. But you can only do that to the extent that the police have been annulled. And a lot of these movements, they just haven't gone far enough in really weakening the state. And so there's very little they can experiment with, and they're forced to kind of rely on market mechanisms and things like that, which is not to criticize. Movements need to do what they can. But I think what we see in many movements so far is not just the absence of a vision, but the absence of some key preconditions which require the weakening of the power of the state. I'm not saying, abolish it overnight, because that happens nowhere, right? It's always a process, right? Even when you split the army and it collapses, there's still, generals, and they have control of some officers, and, they can still do lots of stuff. So I think that, that's my sense, is that prefiguration is really limited, absent those kinds of insurrectionary conditions. It's not to say that people can't experiment with these protocols, and they may be useful, but I think that it's important to recognize that there's a big difference between, a situation where there's been some kind of partial collapse of state power and where there hasn't been. And that, that's what we see in insurrections in our time, is this kind of partial collapse. But so far, nobody's really opened up the rift.
Okay, interesting. I mean, honestly, I do see the risk of kind of maneuvering into some type of waiting for Godot type of situation where we kind of not sit and wait. That's not what you're saying. You emphasize that we can do a lot, but it has a bit of a waiting for the moment type of situation.
Well, how are you going to socialize production if you can't take over the factories, if the police are going to still kick you out?
Right, that's true. I mean, there are, I think I wouldn't argue against the necessity of some form of break, I guess. I do know about certain theoretical strands, at least in the German-speaking commons theory, who argue for a Keimform theory is the wording, a seed form theory, I guess, with regards to commoning. So they would at least argue, I guess, that the way in which we can expand what is organized through forms of commoning goes maybe a bit further than what you might think is possible. But I think I'm split here, because I totally can see the argument that there are, very factual limits in terms of the powers of capital are trying to hinder you.
I support those projects too, and I think that they're useful and interesting, and they're important to provide examples for people. But they're usually mediated by capitalism at one level or another, and that's important to recognize. No, that's true. And I also have to. There's I'm not sure if it's the title of a paper. I think from Gibson and Graham, which goes something like,
why can feminists have a revolution and Marxists have to wait? I didn't read the paper, and I had to think about it. It came to my mind right now, I have to say. I get the point that you're making, I think, but maybe before I ask the final question, I really like the way that you speculated and provided a alternative version of the George Floyd uprising at the end of the book in order to illustrate what would have been needed in the uprising in order to kind of channel this abolitionist sentiment into a different form of revolutionary action. So could you maybe run us through this kind of speculative alternative example and explain what general lessons it might hold for future struggles?
Yeah, so the analysis I performed there is really a thought experiment, and should be taken with a certain grain of salt. And then I'm looking at the George Floyd uprising as an example of a kind of pattern of uprisings that we've seen over the last 10 years. And so I'm more talking to the general example than I am to the specific one. But you have to kind of work with what you have at hand. And so we have this movement in which abolition was the kind of rallying cry, and it was materialized through the burning of the third precinct, which kind of gave an image to that. But from that basis, what horizon could we imagine for the revolution? You can burn hundreds of police stations, as happened in Egypt, and not necessarily get any closer to socialization. That may be necessary and sort of part of the project, but there's a sort of an absent positive moment in that trajectory. And people did try to kind of create spaces, autonomous spaces in the George Floyd uprising, but because of the complexity of it, because of the dynamics of race and racialization, and the fact that so many people were armed, and that you had, vigilante counter-protesters and fascists trying to attack these things, it was very, very chaotic. And most people concluded that that was just a kind of stupid idea to try to kind of stabilize some space for deliberation and discussion. And I can understand that their exhaustion at this. And it partly comes out of a kind of criticism of earlier cycles of struggle, like Occupy. But ultimately, I don't think that there's any way around something like that. And you see it in all the other movements. They always kind of, coalesce into these assemblies. Assemblyism is in some way the kind of essential feature of struggles of our time, is that people kind of come together, not necessarily to make decisions, but to coordinate, to be together. And I think we have to accept that as kind of one impulse in our time, and imagine kind of how that would succeed in opening up the rupture and beginning the process of socialization. So what if, those groups, which were maybe tied to particular occupied sites, thought of themselves as abolition committees, or councils, as it were, and were interested in the kind of practical work of abolition, which would be not just kind of creating spaces that are free of the police, but also, spaces where there is an absence of policing, and people haven't simply taken up the kind of violent policing of the movement on behalf of the police, and would require the development of sort of, ways of dealing with conflict and kind of new ethics. But also it would be about examining the necessary anti-capitalist character of abolition, which is that you can't abolish the police if you still have, widespread poverty and misery and deprivation, right? And there, when you open up spaces like this, you immediately encounter so many forms of deprivation and so you need to kind of immediately begin to socialize resources. To the extent that state power has been annulled, you might have opportunities to do that, and also opportunities to push things forward and begin to do that work of socializing, or at least thinking about what you would do if you had the opportunity. And so people could do disruptive actions, but they could also, begin socializing wealth, and they can begin to really think about, what would a society without the police look like, and what would it require? And it would have to be a communist society, because if it's a class society, it will be a police society. And so, that's one vision for a movement like the George Floyd uprising to succeed. And then there are many things that are very particular to the United States that we could say about the kind of, the language that it might use or the particular problems that it might encounter. But that's a bit outside of my analysis. I mean, that, a movement that's likely to succeed in the United States would have to, draw upon the vocabulary of resistance in the U.S., which is, in many ways, the vocabulary of the Black radical tradition, and the labor movement. But I think that would probably be a very big part of it. But that's, for future movements to kind of figure out how that plays out.
And just for me to understand, because you just mentioned that if a movement like that, even if it would have the knowledge and maybe even some form of experience with regard to alternative forms of self-organization, in this case, I guess, as well, even if it would have this knowledge and certain skills, it would still have to start from a point of material condition in which, for example, as you just mentioned, there is not as of a devastating level of suffering and misery, because then it would be more or less overwhelmed by all of these different tasks at once. Did I get that right? Because autonomous...
Yeah. No, I think it will need to meet those tasks, but of course it would need to do it in a particular way. But I think you have to accept that you're going to be overwhelmed by these forms of material deprivation, and if you don't address them immediately, you're lost.
Okay, that was the point. Mm-hmm.
And I think that would be the project of abolition. For example, right, in Minneapolis, I think they took over a hotel and put some people in it. But that could maybe be done on a much larger scale. For example, to go to the idea of inquiry that I close with, right? What if people had come up with a database of all the vacant housing in the city, right? And then they could also, come up with some mechanism to assess need for housing and put people in houses, and do it on a massive scale. And if the police were otherwise hamstrung, there you go, you've done something. You haven't necessarily, and that might cause all kinds of other conflicts, right? Where some people aren't able to really live on their own, and so maybe you have other ways of addressing that. There's a lot of really incredible, very particular kind of needs that maybe can't be addressed immediately. So you're not addressing everything, but you are starting to address things. Feeding people, very basic, a very powerful thing, trying to, feed as many hungry people as you can. But, obviously, if those tasks are, you can't let the tasks overwhelm you, but you do have to address them. And that's how you grow as a movement, right? By making abolition really mean something, or whatever it is, that's the slogan of your movement.
So we would need what you call a atlas of communist reproduction.
That's right.
Which gives us a certain type of knowledge and informational base. We would need a certain set of skills. We would need the principles that you kind of derived, or we would need to adhere to the principles that you arrived from, or that you derived from your analysis of the council movements of the past. Yeah. Maybe as a final question with regard to what the conditions would need to be in order to be successful with some form of council communist revolution, what would you say is the thing that makes this offer that you're kind of laying out? What is the thing that makes this offer attractive in the eyes of the vast majority of people?
Well, I think in a moment of crisis or rupture, it gives people an opportunity to meet their needs. And so that's the real value, is that these become mechanisms whereby people can meet their needs and improve their life. I also just think that people want to be a part of things. Maybe not everybody, but what I've seen is that movements like this, they fulfill they fulfill a need for meaning, social meaning, and belonging, to be heard, that is really valuable. When you hold an assembly and you see people who've really like maybe never addressed a group before or been listened to in that way, it's quite incredible. And so I think people get something out of participating in these kinds of things. They get something out of doing things that make their lives better and that also are helping other people. And I think that's just there's a real value. Now that won't overwhelm people's desire for safety and security, right? They also don't like to be shot by the police or things like that, right? And so that can start to weigh it down. But I think we have to, always keep in mind that the goal of these movements is to make people's lives better, and there may be limits to how much you can do that and how quickly. But if you forget that, you've lost completely. And the vast majority of humanity lives still in incredible conditions of poverty and deprivation. I mean, in the United States, is of course, everybody is aghast when they come here at how extreme poverty is. But of course, globally, there are so many forms of hell. And I don't think it's so hard to ask what most people in those conditions would get out of a revolution. They get the chance to improve their lives and to also be a part of something and to grow and develop. That's this idea, is that people want to freely develop, and that means they want to eat, but they want to do more than eat. They want to learn. They want to think together. They want to plan together. They want to have kids, take care of kids, all these kinds of things, right?
I'm not sure if you remember it, Jasper, but at the end I always ask the question, if you think about the future, what makes you joyful?
I mean, knowing that people will resist, and that there's still hope for us, as grim as things look, that humans have an incredible capacity for resistance and creativity, and it's not over yet. We still have a chance to kind of do things differently, and I just kind of want to see what happens. I'm hopeful. I'm optimistic that we'll get some chance in the near future. And even if not, then, at least people tried.
Okay, Jasper, thank you so much for being part of Future Histories.
All right. Thank you. Thank you for having me. It was a great conversation once again.
That was our show for today. Thanks a lot for listening. If you want to support Future Histories, you can do so on Patreon. For this, visit patreon.com/futurehistories, or you can simply tell a friend that you liked the show and that he, she, or they might like it as well. Thanks a lot, and hear you in 2 weeks.